All right, everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at ecological succession.
Ooh, that's a fun one.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about how plant communities change over time, and we're actually going to be looking at two different types of succession. We've got primary succession, and we've got secondary succession.
Okay.
So we're going to be talking about a lot of really cool things today, like how nature is able to bounce back from some pretty serious disturbances, and you'll even hear about a plant that's nicknamed a purple plague. It's causing quite a stir in some ecosystems.
That's a good one.
All right, so to kind of set the scene here, imagine a landscape that's been totally stripped bare. Just rocks as far as the eye can see. Maybe it's after a glacier retreats or a volcano erupts. How does life even begin in such a harsh environment?
Well, that's where primary succession comes in. This is the process of life taking root in places where there's no soil, just bare rock.
So no soil, no life, right? What kind of organisms can handle that?
Well, think about those tough little lichens and mosses that you see clinging to rocks. They're the real heroes here. They can actually break down rock over time, creating the first hints of soil.
Wow, starting from scratch. So these tiny organisms are paving the way for everything else.
Exactly. It's a slow and steady process. But as those pioneers break down rock and create soil, you start to see ferns, grasses, even shrubs starting to appear.
Okay, so it's like a chain reaction.
Hmm.
One life form making way for the next. How do we get from these small plants to a full-blown forest, though?
Each generation of plants adds more organic matter to the soil as they grow and die. This makes the soil richer, supporting larger and more diverse plant life. Eventually, these gradual changes lead to what we call a climax community. It's a stable and balanced ecosystem.
So those like iconic forests you see in nature documentaries, the ones just teeming with life.
Exactly. Think of those old-growth forests in Canada with those towering trees and that rich tapestry of plants and animals. Those are prime examples of climax communities that have developed over centuries, sometimes even millennia.
Okay, so that's primary succession, starting from bare rock. What happens when there's already a community, like a forest, and something disrupts it, like a wildfire?
Mm.
Does everything have to start from scratch again?
That's a great question. And it brings us to secondary succession. So imagine a forest after a fire sweeps through. It might look devastated, but the soil is still there, along with nutrients and even seeds that survive the fire.
So it's not a complete reset like primary succession, more like hitting the refresh button.
Exactly. And because there's already soil, secondary succession is much faster. You'll see plants like fireweed and aspen, which thrive in disturbed areas. They quickly colonize that burned area.
Ah, so they're like the first responders of the plant world rushing in to help the ecosystem recover.
That's a great analogy. And over time, those pioneer species create conditions for other plants and animals to return, eventually leading back to a climax forest similar to the original one.
That's amazing. It's like the forest has a memory of what it once was and knows how to rebuild itself.
You're right.
We've also talked about invasive species disrupting these processes, though.
Right. Invasive species can throw a wrench in the works. Remember the purple plague, that seemingly beautiful plant called purple loosestrife?
Oh, yeah. The one that's wreaking havoc on Canadian ecosystems.
That's the one. It arrived from Europe as an ornamental plant. And with no natural predators here, it spreads aggressively outcompeting native species and disrupting those natural succession patterns.
So it's like a guest who overstays their welcome and throws the whole party off.
Exactly. It's a reminder that introducing non-native species, even those with good intentions, can have unintended consequences for these delicate ecosystems. And it's a complex challenge to manage them once they take hold.
That's pretty wild. So we've covered primary succession, we covered secondary succession, but we haven't talked too much about climax communities yet. What exactly defines them?
Well, think of a climax community as the mature stage of an ecosystem. The types of plants and animals are relatively stable. They found a balance with each other and the environment. It's like a well-rehearsed play where everyone knows their role.
So it's like a static picture, frozen in time, or is there still change happening?
That's a great question. It's not static. Individuals are born, they grow, they reproduce, they die. But that overall composition of the community remains relatively balanced. It's more like a bustling city. People come and go, but the city itself persists.
That makes a lot more sense. So it's about maintaining that balance, even with all the changes happening within the ecosystem. We also need to talk about humans, though. We're not exactly known for being subtle when it comes to nature.
You're right. Unfortunately, human activities can have a significant impact on succession, sometimes interrupting those natural processes or even preventing them altogether.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How are we messing things up?
Well, deforestation is a big one. We clear vast tracts of forest for lumber, for agriculture, for development, disrupting those carefully balanced climax communities that took centuries to develop.
So it's not just about planting new trees. We're disrupting an entire web of life that's taken ages to evolve.
Exactly. And it's not just deforestation. Think about fragmentation. We build roads, subdivisions, shopping malls, carving up the landscape into smaller and smaller patches.
So even if secondary succession kicks in, those isolated patches might not be big enough to support all the species that were there before.
Precisely. It's like trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces. And then there's our love for introducing non-native species, which can have unintended consequences.
Like our friend the purple plague.
Exactly. We often don't realize the ripple effects of our actions until it's too late.
This is pretty heavy stuff. Sounds like we have a lot to learn about our role in these complex ecosystems. I'm curious about the flip side, though. Are there cases where humans are actually helping ecosystems recover?
That's a great question. And it's something we'll explore in our next class. There are definitely examples of successful restoration efforts where humans have played a positive role in helping ecosystems bounce back after disturbances. It's not all doom and gloom.
Okay, that gives me some hope. I'm definitely ready for some good news after all this. But before we move on, can you give me a quick recap of the key takeaways from today's lesson?
Absolutely. We learned that ecological succession is this incredible journey of life, reclaiming barren landscapes. Whether it's starting from scratch with primary succession or hitting the refresh button with secondary succession.
Right, and we saw how climax communities represent those amazing, balanced ecosystems that have developed over long periods. But we also learned that human activities can disrupt these processes.
Yes, but the good news is that we can also play a positive role in restoring ecosystems and ensuring their resilience for the future.
All right, class dismissed for now.
Yeah.
But be sure to do your homework. Go outside and observe the natural world around you. See if you can spot any signs of succession in action.
Welcome back. So last time we were talking about how those plant communities change over time. We talked about primary and secondary succession, how nature has this incredible ability to rebuild and renew.
Right, it's like nature has this blueprint for restoring balance, but we also saw how human activities can sometimes, throw a wrench into those plans.
Exactly. And today we're going to delve a little bit deeper into this fascinating world of climax communities. Remember, those are those stable end stages of succession where ecosystems have had a chance to really find that balance over time.
Right, so it's kind of like reaching the peak of a mountain after a really long climb.
Yeah.
You've made it, you're at the stable state. But I'm curious, do all ecosystems eventually reach this climax community?
That's a great question. Not necessarily. It's important to remember that succession is a process, and it can be influenced by a whole host of factors. Things like climate change, invasive species, even those human activities that we talked about can shift things, can change the course.
So it's like trying to hit a moving target. The goalposts keep shifting.
Exactly. But let's focus on those cases where ecosystems do reach a climax community. What defines those balanced ecosystems? What makes them so special?
Well, we talked about how the specific type of climax community depends on the environment, right?
Yeah.
Like a desert wouldn't have the same climax community as a rainforest.
Absolutely. Factors like temperature, rainfall, soil type, even altitude, they all play a huge role in shaping the plant and animal communities that make up a climax community.
So it's not just about the plants, it's about that whole web of life, right?
Yeah.
The animals, the fungi, the microorganisms, they're all part of this interconnected system.
Precisely. It's like a complex tapestry woven together by the interactions between all those living organisms and their physical environment. It's about finding that sweet spot where everything works together in harmony.
Okay, that makes sense. So can you paint me a picture of what a climax community might look like here in Canada?
Absolutely. Imagine you're traveling across Canada, starting in the north, up in the Arctic, you'd find tundra, a climax community adapted to those harsh cold conditions. Think low-growing plants like mosses, lichens, maybe some hardy shrubs, a stark but beautiful landscape.
Wow, I can practically feel the wind whipping across the tundra. So what happens as we travel south?
As you move south, the climate warms up a bit, and you encounter the boreal forest. Think of those dense forests of coniferous trees like spruce, fir, pine. They can handle those long, cold winters and the shorter summers.
It's amazing how the landscape can change so dramatically just by traveling a few hundred miles.
Absolutely. And as you continue south, those winters become milder, the summers warmer. You start to see mixed forests, a blend of those coniferous and deciduous trees. And finally, in the southernmost parts of Canada, you'll find those lush deciduous forests with those vibrant colors in the fall. Think maples, oaks, beech trees.
So it's like a gradient of climax communities across Canada, each one perfectly adapted to its specific climate and environment.
Exactly. And this diversity of climax communities showcases the incredible adaptability of life. It's a testament to the power of evolution and that delicate balance of nature.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the complexity of these climax communities. But you mentioned earlier that they're not static, that they're dynamic. What do you mean by that?
Well, while the overall composition of a climax community stays relatively stable, it's not like a photograph frozen in time. Individuals within that community are constantly changing. Trees grow old and fall, new seedlings sprout, animals are born and die. It's a constant cycle of life and death.
So it's like a forest where trees are always growing and falling, but the overall forest remains. There's this constant renewal happening beneath the surface.
Precisely. And it's this dynamic balance that allows climax communities to be so resilient. They can absorb these changes without being completely disrupted. It's like a well-oiled machine with all the parts working together smoothly.
That's fascinating. But what happens if there's a major disturbance, like a fire or a storm? Does that climax community just disappear?
Not necessarily. Climax communities have evolved over time to withstand those natural disturbances. In fact, many forests are adapted to periodic fires. Some tree species even rely on fire to regenerate.
Wait, fire can be a good thing. I always thought of it as destructive.
Well, it depends on the context. In some ecosystems, fire is a natural part of the cycle. It can help clear out deadwood, create open spaces for new growth, and even stimulate the germination of certain seeds.
So it's like a reset button for the ecosystem, helping to maintain that dynamic balance we talked about.
Exactly. But it's important to distinguish between natural disturbances like those fires or storms and human-caused disturbances. Those can be a lot more problematic.
Right, because we tend to do things on a much larger scale and at a much faster pace than nature does.
Absolutely. Things like deforestation, pollution, and climate change can push ecosystems beyond their ability to recover. They disrupt that delicate balance that's taken centuries to achieve.
This is really making me think about the ethical considerations of our actions.
Hmm.
If we know that our activities can disrupt these complex ecosystems, do we have a responsibility to try to minimize our impact?
That's a really important question, and it's something that we as a society really need to grapple with. How do we balance our needs with the needs of the natural world? How do we become better stewards of these incredible ecosystems?
Those are some heavy questions. I'm definitely ready for a break after all this deep thinking.
Me too. Let's take a pause and come back refreshed for our next class, where we'll explore some of the ways humans are impacting succession, both for better and for worse.
Okay, so we've been on this incredible journey exploring ecological succession. We've seen how life can reclaim barren landscapes.
Oh.
We've talked about those balanced ecosystems that develop over time, but we've also, hinted at the fact that humans can sometimes mess things up.
Right. We've touched on some of the ways that human activities can disrupt these processes, but let's kind of delve a little deeper into those impacts today, both the good and the bad.
Okay, so let's start with the not so good news. What are some of the biggest ways we're impacting those delicate ecosystems?
Well, deforestation is a big one. We talked about how clearing forests disrupts those carefully balanced climax communities that take centuries to develop.
Yeah, and it's not just about planting new trees. It's about recognizing that we're disrupting this entire web of life that's evolved over time.
Exactly. Think about those old growth forests with those towering trees and incredible biodiversity. You can't just recreate that overnight. When
Yeah.
those forests are cleared, it sets the stage for secondary succession. But it can take centuries for that ecosystem to recover to anything resembling its original state.
It's like trying to rebuild a masterpiece after someone has torn it to shreds. You might be able to put some of the pieces back together, but it's just not going to be the same.
That's a great analogy. And then there's this issue of fragmentation. We build roads, housing developments, shopping malls. All of these things carve up the landscape into smaller and smaller patches.
Right. So even if secondary succession can begin, those isolated patches might not be big enough to support all the species that were once there.
Exactly. It limits the ability of plants and animals to move and disperse, which can reduce genetic diversity and make populations more vulnerable to extinction. It's like trying to survive on a tiny island surrounded by a sea of concrete.
This makes me think about those invasive species that we discussed earlier. It seems like humans have this knack for introducing species that just totally disrupt the natural balances.
You're right. We often don't realize the ripple effects of our actions until it's too late. Remember the purple loosestrife? It's just one example of an invasive plant that can outcompete native species and totally alter those succession patterns.
It's like we're accidentally throwing a wild card into the game and it throws everything off. But amidst all this, is there any good news? Are there cases where humans are actually helping ecosystems to recover?
Absolutely. There are. While we often hear about the negative impacts, there are also really inspiring examples of ecological restoration where humans are playing a positive role.
Okay, that gives me some hope. Tell me more.
Well, think about areas that have been degraded by things like mining or pollution. There are scientists and conservationists working really hard to restore those areas using techniques that mimic natural succession processes.
So they're essentially giving nature a helping hand to get back on track.
Precisely. They might start by planting native species, controlling erosion, or even reintroducing key animal species that help to disperse seeds and maintain that balance.
It's like we're learning to be better partners with nature,
Mhm.
recognizing that we have a responsibility to help repair the damage that we've caused.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about these large-scale restoration projects. Each of us can make choices in our daily lives that support biodiversity and healthy ecosystems.
So what can we do? Give us some practical tips.
Well, think about your garden. Are you planting native species that support local pollinators? Are you using natural fertilizers and avoiding pesticides that can harm beneficial insects?
Those are things that we can all do. It's about making conscious choices that recognize that interconnectedness of all living things.
Exactly. We need to shift our thinking from seeing ourselves as separate from nature to recognizing that we are a part of it. Our actions have consequences, but they can also have really positive impacts.
This has been such an incredible journey exploring this power of nature to renew itself and these complex ways that humans are impacting those processes. It's definitely given me a lot to think about and a renewed appreciation for the importance of protecting our planet's precious ecosystems.
I'm so glad to hear that. Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding the science of ecological succession, we can all become better stewards of our planet. We can make choices that support biodiversity, conserve resources, and ensure a healthy future for generations to come.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.